It's my pleasure now to introduce Jacqueline Dinan. Where are you, Jacqueline? Oh, there you are.
On my way.
Right, okay. And it's going to tell us all about the Wasbies. I said in my keynote that this book told us things we didn't know, and the extent of Australian involvement in the Wasbies is one of them. So I'm looking forward very much to listening. Jacqueline is a versatile freelance writer, I think that would be the way to describe it, among other things, and notable for her book Between the Lines, which captured the stories of hundreds of Australian women about in the Second World War. So Jacqueline.
Picture yourself as a frontline soldier, whether you're English, Indian, African American, or perhaps even Gurkha. You're one of the many units fighting in the tropical jungles of Burma. Enduring the humidity, the rain, the challenging terrain, you are eventually relieved of duties and moved to the rear. A few kilometres away, where you can still grimace at the sound of gunfire, is a mobile food and beverage canteen in a clearing. What a welcome sight. Furthermore, it's run by women, real women, as one soldier was quoted as saying. A cup of tea is on offer. There's also some cake and sandwiches. How civilised, how very British. It's bewildering that after the Japanese occupation of Burma, Commandant Dinan Taylor was able to convince authorities to allow her to relaunch the Women's Auxiliary Service Burma, WAS. Commonly known though as the Wasbies, which first existed in Rangoon from January 1942, the formation initially provided clerical services. The Wasbies were mainly the daughters and wives of British officers, civil servants, colonial expats and missionaries. Ninian, for example, was the wife of the colonel of the Burma Rifles. These women were in Burma, in Burma's capital, when it fell to the Japanese forces in March 1942. In Ninian's post-war reflection, she said, the girls had shown such courage in carrying out their work during the bombing and machine gunning in Burma. The girls were launched into battle overnight. There was no time for training. They worked providing food and drinks for the troops, tending the wounded, driving transport, and generally helping with the evacuation. Ninian, assisted by her deputy Lower St. John, took the Wasbies north from Rangoon over 600 kilometres by train. It was described as a journey through hell. Near Mandalay, they were billeted in a ramshackle house and continued their work. Further evacuation to India was required, and they set up their base in Shillong in the hills of Assam, where it was relatively cooler. Ninian herself, plus 5 other women, initially ran a mobile food canteen around Shillong and into forward areas. Her further plans were inevitably met with resistance. She, described as an indomitable woman, had a terrific fight with the powers to be. So by May 1943, her setup had expanded to 8 canteens and 51 workers. This group included Australian World War I nurse Bernice Lowry, who had served in Egypt, Gallipoli and Mesopotamia. She was a Wasbie until 1945, during which year she was mentioned in dispatches, but soon after she was killed in a jeep accident. She is one of 3 Wasbies who died in transport accidents, yet the only Australian woman commemorated on the Rangoon War Memorial. As part of ongoing expansion, Australian Merle Laundry was tasked with opening up another canteen, and she said, Nin gave me confidence with her clear instructions. She was not the only Wasbie who excelled expectations. Recruited in 1944, Jessie Nicholson, who had been educated in Perth, was awarded the British Empire Medal for meritorious service, and the citation read, throughout the very difficult physical conditions of heavy monsoon, during military operations, the breakout of enemy, in danger of ambushes and booby traps, the canteen, under the command of this young commissioned officer, operated continually. Early 1945, the Wasbies were operating 14 canteens, yet Ninian Taylor urged that her service could still do more. By the middle of that year, the government of Burma also realised the extent of major civil and military tasks ahead as the Japanese were defeated in their country. Throughout 1945, when the Japanese were being pushed and then were ignoring Allied calls for its unconditional surrender, Dinan followed a directive from Allied Land Forces Commander Southeast Asia to recruit more Wasbies from India, England, or its colonies. The recruitment drive in Australia, which took place in July 1945, was hotly debated. An ex-Servicemen's Association advocated that Australian women should be present to support Australians serving and to be present when POWs from the Australian 8th Division were recovered. But Australia's Adjunct General strongly recommended that no authority be given to permit Australians to enlist, as women were still required in the services at home. The solution was to rally expatriate women who had been earlier evacuated to Australia. Prime Minister Chifley, in accord with the Australian Army, gave no objections on the grounds of manpower or security to the departure of these expat women from Australia. Nevertheless, about a dozen women, either Australian-born or with strong ties to Australia, managed to slip through the cracks and serve in the WAS between 42 and 46. As example, Robin Walker faced compassionate grounds for discharge from her clerical role at HMAS Monterey. The recruitment drive in Australia was led by Lee Massey, former school captain of St Catherine's in Toorak. She flew from Burma, where she was with her husband who was serving there, to cities including Melbourne, where she mustered the support of leaders of the Australian Women's Army Service, the AWAS, to assist with interviewing process, and furthermore, she engaged the Australian media as a communications conduit. One media source wrote about Massey's uniform as one of the most interesting things about her. Another expressed that she didn't look tough enough to stand the life. She's much too attractive. But Massey was focused on her task of sourcing women aged between 20 to 45, preferably former residents of the Far East, because they had experienced this range of customs, dialects, and climatic conditions. Some recruits even spoke the local languages of Burmese, Urdu, or Hindi. Dorothy Kosh of Sydney wrote that she had a good working knowledge of Malayan and understood the idiosyncrasies of the natives. Primarily, the women had to be physically suited to operate static and mobile food canteens for the occupation armies of Southeast Asia Command. The conditions ahead would be rigorous. Monsoon rains that made waterways unpredictable or turned dusty roads into a quagmire of mud, through which they had to steer 3-ton Chevrolet vans with drum brakes and manual steering. Unrelenting humidity, sleeping on stretcher beds, lifting kettles filled with water from drums, plus big heavy sacks of dry goods, all while enduring the pain and discomfort of a menstrual cycle in the heat. Not to forget the malarial mosquitoes, leeches, snakes, and infestations of rats that kept the keeping of dry foods very challenging. Someone who knew hardship and harrowing conditions was Elsa Dixon, who by the autumn of 1945 was recuperating in Sydney after spending 3 years as an internee of the Japanese. An article encouraging recruitment to Burma caught Elsa's attention, and after an arduous boat and train trip, she was in Shillong by October, working as a stenographer before operating a mobile food van in the hills of Mandalay for the troops returning from the front line. It was only last year that the delightful and glamorous Elsa passed away, just short of 100 years old. She was one of 300 women, as Peter mentioned, that I interviewed for Between the Dances, a collection of short stories about women in World War II. And just by chance, Peter's late mother, Marjorie, also put her story into that. And she very humbly said to me, "My son is a military historian, you know." Aboard the same ship was Mary Cameron, who was applying clerical and driving duties in the bombed and burnt-out city of Rangoon. There was also Nan Housen, who became the photographer for the WAS, and maybe took many of these photos. That's when she was not working in the canteens. These new recruits, who were civilians in military employment, had to adhere to the rules applicable to British soldiers. They were issued with a kit of staple items and had to visit a local tailor to get their uniforms made. The khaki dresses and skirts were enhanced by epaulets supporting a black embroidered chintzy emblem. Headwear was a turban-style collar to wrap up their hair during times of food service, in contrast to a jaunty beret for more formal occasions. They were only given 3 to 4 weeks of basic training in driving, cooking, bookkeeping, stock-taking and how to shoot a weapon. They accepted the Hessian-shrouded latrines and washing facilities. It is noteworthy, though, that many of these women were from affluent circumstances and, of course, comfortable living conditions. Carleen Reid from Hobart had previously worked as a confidential secretary for the Deputy Commissioner for Selangor. Ruth Rutherford was the daughter of the Governor of Bihar. But in their khaki uniforms and working in a team of 6, there was no differentiation, as they operated static or mobile canteens. The static canteens were based at places of transition, railway stations, airfields, places of rest, camps, leave centres, dressing stations, convalescent homes, and eventually POW reception centres, where they showed the men calmness, dignity and compassion. Whereas the mobile canteens drove to gun sites and isolated areas behind the front line. Assisted by drivers from the British other ranks and Indian workers, they operated from the length of Burma, from Myitkyina in the north to Mumbai in the south. Each van had the acronym WASB painted on its panels. The side panels were sometimes the rear panel, hinged out to form a canopy under which the women stood to serve an impressive range of, considering the circumstances. You'll see there on the bottom left that the back panels opened up to serve. And I should have mentioned bottom right, seated bottom right, is Elsa that I mentioned. And on the top row seated, second to your right, is Ninian Taylor with this sort of hairdo. And the Jeep above, top right-hand corner, is Mary Cameron. And her daughter is coming tomorrow. Aside from hot and cold drinks, there was bacon and eggs, pies and toasted sandwiches, referred to as char and wads, I'm not sure why, but some various snacks as well. A soldier could also purchase toiletries, washing powder and medicinal items. Aside from the provision of relative luxuries, the Wasbies were appreciated for their demeanour and conversation that boosted the well-being of the troops. This was evidenced by notices that were left on trees. Wasbies, please call. Post-war, the service and conduct of the Wasbies drew deserved praise. Slim reflected on their devotion and courage during the 1942 retreat from Burma. He said they later devoted themselves with the same efficiency to the troops of the 14th Army. Mountbatten commented that by having the welfare of the troops at heart, the Wasbies were able to do much to alleviate the hardship of the campaign. Further praise came from military leaders such as Stopford and Mansour. 6 Wasbies were appointed MBEs and 30 had been mentioned in dispatches. In October 1947, Ninian was advocating for service medals for the Wasbies. There was no responding correspondence. The file ended at that point. However, tomorrow at the book launch, as I said, the daughter of the top right, she's bringing along her mother's medals, so we'll soon find out what they did receive. The WAS file held at the British Library, dated from 1942 only, lists 243 members. And I thank Andrew's researcher in London for her assistance on the ground there. And as Anthea was saying too, with paintings brought out to light, possibly for the first time, I propose that this primary source manila folder at the British Library may not have seen the light of day since it was archived in 1947. But by this chapter being included in the fight, the story of the Women's Auxiliary Service Burma and the Australian contribution to it has been made available to current day history students, admirers of female trailblazers, and military experts such as yourselves.
Well, thank you, Jacqueline. It looks like we're saving the 3 most poignant papers till the very end, which is a reward for sticking the course.